August 12, 1943. 800 miles southeast of Iceland, where the North Atlantic swells roll like molten pewter under an overcast sky. The cockpit of a PBY-5A Catalina trembles with the deep mechanical heartbeat of twin Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines. Lieutenant Howard Adey adjusts his headset against the constant drone, his breath visible in the thin air at 4,000 feet. Below, an endless expanse of grey water stretches to every horizon, indifferent and alive. The radio crackles with static-laden voices from distant ships. Convoy HX-251, position uncertain. Last contact 12 hours ago. In the cramped navigator's compartment behind him, radioman First Class Tommy Kowalski peers into the amber glow of a revolutionary piece of equipment, the ASV Mark III centimetric radar, its cathode ray tube painting ghostly green traces across a circular screen. This is the new frontier of warfare, where electrons hunt steel beneath the waves, and men with slide rules have become the architects of victory. The war had taught the Kriegsmarine to mock American ingenuity with calculated disdain. Amerikanische Wasserflieger, they called the patrol aircraft. American waterbirds, clumsy and predictable. In the concrete bunkers of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, U-boat commanders shared sardonic laughter over reports of Allied air patrol. These flying boats, Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Zimmermann had written to his wife in Bremen, are like fishing nets with holes too large for the fish. They see nothing, catch nothing, and return home with stories of shadows. The confidence was not unfounded. For nearly 2 years, German submarines had operated with near impunity in the vast reaches of the North Atlantic, surfacing at night to charge batteries and traverse at high speed, disappearing before dawn into the protective depths. The ocean was their ally, darkness their shield, and the primitive radar systems of 1941 and 1942 were little more than electronic curiosities, prone to failure and confusion. Admiral Karl Dönitz himself had proclaimed the Atlantic a German lake, where wolf packs could feast on Allied shipping while remaining virtually invisible to aerial reconnaissance. The arrogance was systematic, institutional, and about to be shattered by the marriage of British scientific innovation and American industrial might. The PBY Catalina that carried Lieutenant Adey through the hostile skies above the convoy routes was far more than the ungainly seaplane the Germans dismissed. Born from the design genius of Isaac Ladden at Consolidated Aircraft, the Catalina represented a synthesis of aeronautical engineering and maritime warfare requirements that had taken nearly a decade to perfect. Each aircraft carried a crew of 8 to 10 men, specialists trained in the complex choreography of anti-submarine. The hull, constructed from aluminum alloy, riveted with precision that rivaled Swiss watchmaking, could withstand the punishment of heavy seas during water landing, while maintaining structural integrity at altitudes up to 20,000 feet. The twin R1830 twin Wasp engine, each producing 1,200 horsepower, provided the endurance necessary for patrol missions lasting up to 15 hours, longer than most men could remain alert, longer than the human body was designed to function in the cramped, noisy environment of a military aircraft. But it was the invisible cargo that transformed these flying boats from mere reconnaissance platforms into instruments of technological warfare. The ASV Mark III radar, developed in the laboratories of the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, England, represented a quantum leap in electronic detection capability. Unlike the primitive meter-wave systems of earlier years, this new radar operated on a wavelength of 10 centimeters, allowing it to penetrate weather that had previously blinded aerial reconnaissance. More importantly, it could detect the metallic signature of a submarine's conning tower or periscope at distances up to 12 miles, even in conditions of poor visibility that had once rendered U-boats effectively invisible. Accompanying this radar revolution was an equally innovative weapon system that would prove decisive in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Lee Light, named for squadron leader Humphrey de Verde, Lee of the Royal Air Force, was a 1,000,000-candle-power searchlight mounted beneath the aircraft's wing, synchronized with the radar to illuminate targets at the precise moment of attack. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Use radar to locate a surface submarine in darkness. Approach at low altitude with engines throttled back to minimize detection. Then at the last possible moment, flood the target with blinding white light while releasing depth charges programmed to explode at predetermined depth. The psychological effect on submarine crews was devastating. Men accustomed to the protective anonymity of darkness suddenly found themselves exposed, vulnerable, caught in a cone of pitiless illumination with nowhere to hide. The engineering challenges had been immense. The searchlight had to be powerful enough to illuminate a target at distances of up to 2 miles, yet lightweight enough not to compromise the aircraft's range and maneuverability. The electrical system required massive generators that consumed precious fuel and added significant weight to an already overloaded aircraft. The coordination between radar operator, pilot, and bombardier demanded split-second timing and months of training to achieve even minimal proficiency. By August 1943, these systems had been refined, tested, and deployed across the full spectrum of Allied anti-submarine aircraft, transforming the nighttime surface of the North Atlantic from a sanctuary for U-boats into a hunting ground where the hunters had become the hunted. The first encounters between these technologically enhanced Allied patrol aircraft and the German submarine fleet revealed the cruel mathematics of learning curves in wartime. Lieutenant Addy's squadron, VP-84, had lost 4 aircraft and 32 men in their initial months of operations, victims of mechanical failure, navigational errors, and the unforgiving nature of maritime patrol flying. The early radar sets were temperamental, prone to failure in the salt spray and constant vibration of long-range flight. Pilots, trained in the visual techniques of peacetime flying, struggled to interpret the abstract patterns of radar contacts, chasing false echoes into storms and fuel exhaustion. The coordination between radar detection and searchlight illumination required a precision that seemed impossible under combat conditions. Too early, and the submarine would dive to safety. Too late, and the aircraft would overfly the target without delivering its weapon. More devastating still was the realization that German submarine commanders had adapted their tactics to counter the early radar systems. U-boats began diving at the first hint of aircraft engines, remaining submerged for hours until the patrol aircraft, running low on fuel, was forced to abandon the search. The failure rate was catastrophic. In the first 6 months of 1943, Allied patrol aircraft achieved successful attacks on fewer than 8% of radar contact, a statistic that called into question the entire doctrine of airborne anti-submarine war. The psychological toll on aircrews was severe. Men like Howard Addy found themselves flying 15-hour missions through weather that grounded civilian aviation, seeking an enemy that appeared on their screens as anonymous blips, knowing that a single mechanical failure or navigational error could sentence them to death by drowning in water too cold to survive more than minutes. The loneliness was existential, vast expanses of ocean where a man could disappear without trace, where heroism and cowardice looked identical, where survival depended more on mathematics and machinery than on courage or skill. Radio conversations with distant ships provided the only human contact during these marathons of solitude, voices crackling through static to report positions, weather conditions, and the grim tallies of ships lost to torpedo attack. Convoy SC-130, 3 ships missing, oil slick observed, no survivors. The war had become an abstraction of numbers and coordinates, where victory was measured not in territory captured, but in tonnage preserved, where success meant that merchant sailors would live to see another sunrise over the grey expanse of the North Atlantic. The transformation began with incremental discovery, small adaptations that accumulated into tactical revolution. Lieutenant Addy had developed an instinct for reading the radar scope that went beyond technical training, an ability to distinguish between the electronic signatures of submarines, whales, debris, and wave patterns that could only be acquired through hundreds of hours of practice. More importantly, he had learned to think like his prey, anticipating the tactical decisions of submarine commanders based on weather conditions, time of day, and proximity to convoy routes. On the night of August 12th, tracking a contact that had appeared intermittently on his radar for over an hour, Addy made a calculated decision that would prove pivotal, not only for his own survival, but for the future of anti-submarine warfare. Instead of following standard doctrine, approaching directly from the radar bed, he chose to orbit the contact at maximum detection rate, observing its movement patterns and waiting for the optimal moment to attack. The submarine, U-456, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Max Martin Teichert, was following a predictable pattern, surfacing to charge batteries, running at high speed on the surface for 20 minutes, then submerging for 10 minutes before surfacing. Teichert was confident in his invisibility, unaware that every movement was being tracked by electronic eyes 8 miles away. At 0347 hours, Addy observed the submarine surface for what analysis would later determine was a battery charging cycle. Rather than attacking immediately, he coordinated with his crew to execute a systematic approach that would maximize their chances of success. The radar operator, Petty Officer Kowalski, provided continuous range and bearing information, while the bombardier, Aviation Ordnanceman Second Class Jake Morrison, prepared 4 Mark 44 depth charges for release. The flight engineer monitored engine performance and electrical systems, ensuring that the Lee light would function at the critical moment. Most importantly, ADI had calculated the precise timing required to catch the submarine in its most vulnerable state, surfaced, stationary, with its crew focused on mechanical operations rather than anti-aircraft vigilance. The approach was executed with the precision of a surgical procedure. Engines throttled back to minimize acoustic signature, altitude reduced to 150 feet to maximize radar accuracy, airspeed maintained at exactly 140 knots to provide optimal conditions for depth charge release. At a range of 2 miles, with the submarine clearly visible on radar and beginning what appeared to be a crash dive, ADI activated the Lee light. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. U-456, caught in the act of submerging, was illuminated like an insect under a microscope, its crew frozen in panic as they realized that darkness was no longer their protector. The depth charges, released with mathematical precision, bracketed the submarine's position and detonated at depths calculated to crush the pressure hull, regardless of the boat's diving angle. The success of this single engagement reverberated through the Allied command structure with the force of a tactical revolution. Within weeks, standardized procedures based on ADI's innovations were distributed to every anti-submarine squadron in the Atlantic theater. The combination of centimetric radar, coordinated searchlight attacks, and precisely timed depth charge releases had transformed night patrol missions from exercises in futility into systematic hunting expeditions. The statistics reflected this transformation with dramatic clarity. In September 1943, Allied patrol aircraft achieved successful attacks on 43% of radar contact, an improvement of more than 500% over the previous year's performance. More significantly, the psychological impact on German submarine crews began to manifest in measurably altered behavior patterns. Intercepted radio communications revealed increasing reluctance to surface at night, extended battery charging cycles that left U-boats with insufficient power for high-speed transit, and a growing preference for remaining submerged even when tactical situations demanded surface operation. The night surface of the North Atlantic, once the exclusive domain of German submarines, had become contested territory where electronic warfare determined survival. The industrial and technological foundations that made this transformation possible reflected the mature phase of Allied war production, where scientific research, engineering innovation, and manufacturing capacity had achieved unprecedented integration. The Lee light systems rolling off production lines at General Electric and Westinghouse represented the culmination of cooperative research programs involving British scientists, American engineers, and Canadian technicians working in facilities scattered across 3 continents. Each searchlight assembly required precision manufacturing techniques that had been developed for civilian applications but rapidly adapted for military requirement. Aircraft-quality electrical generators, shock-resistant mounting systems, and weather-sealing technologies that could withstand the corrosive environment of maritime patrol flight. The radar systems represented an even more complex industrial achievement, requiring the production of specialized electronic components, magnetrons, waveguides, cathode ray tubes, in quantities that dwarfed peacetime demand. By late 1943, American factories were producing more radar equipment in a single month than had been manufactured in the entire decade of the war, a production miracle that reflected not only industrial capacity but the systematic application of assembly line principles to high-technology manufacturing. The training programs required to operate these systems represented an equally impressive organizational achievement. Technical schools at naval air stations from Pensacola to Seattle graduated thousands of radar operators, each trained in the mathematical principles of electronic detection, the mechanical operation of complex equipment, and the tactical doctrines of anti-submarine warfare. These were not traditional military specialties, but entirely new professional categories created by the demands of technological. A radar operator required skills that bridged electronics engineering, navigation, meteorology, and tactical analysis, knowledge that had to be acquired in months rather than years, under the pressure of wartime urgency. The curriculum included not only technical instruction, but psychological preparation for the isolation and responsibility of long-range patrol flying, where individual decisions could determine the survival of entire convoy. The graduates of these programs, men like Petty Officer Kowalski, represented a new type of warrior, technically sophisticated, scientifically educated, and psychologically adapted to warfare conducted through electronic intermediaries, rather than direct physical confrontation. The German response to these developments revealed both the tactical flexibility and strategic limitations of the Kriegsmarine in the later phases of the war. Submarine commanders, initially skeptical of reports describing Allied aircraft with supernatural detection capabilities, gradually acknowledged the reality of technological obsolescence. U-boat war diaries from late 1943 documented increasingly desperate attempts to counter the new Allied capability. Experimental radar detection equipment, modified surfacing procedures, and tactical formations designed to provide mutual anti-aircraft protection. However, these countermeasures were implemented within the constraints of a submarine fleet that had been designed for an earlier phase of warfare, when stealth and surprise were achieved through operational rather than technological. The fundamental limitation was industrial. Germany lacked the production capacity to retrofit hundreds of submarines with advanced electronic equipment, while simultaneously maintaining the construction rates necessary to replace losses that were mounting at unsustainable levels. More critically, the German war economy could not support the research and development programs necessary to leapfrog Allied technological advantages, particularly in the critical areas of radar and electronic warfare, where British and American scientific establishments had achieved decisive superiority. By December 1943, the statistical evidence of technological transformation in anti-submarine warfare had become undeniable. German submarine losses had increased by more than 200% compared to the previous year, while the percentage of successful torpedo attacks had declined to levels that made continued operations economically unsustainable. The average operational lifespan of a U-boat had dropped from 14 months in 1942 to less than 6 months by the end of 1943. A mortality rate that exceeded the German Navy's ability to train replacement crews. More tellingly, the geographical distribution of submarine losses had shifted dramatically toward the areas covered by long-range Allied patrol aircraft, indicating that electronic detection had become the decisive factor in submarine survival. The night surface attacks that had been the foundation of German submarine tactics had become suicide missions, forcing operational changes that reduced submarine effectiveness by margins that could be measured in mathematical precision. Convoy losses, the ultimate metric of success in the Battle of the Atlantic, had declined to their lowest levels since the beginning of the war, approaching the point where shipping replacement was exceeding losses for the first time since 1940. The human cost of this technological revolution was recorded not only in casualty statistics, but in the transformed nature of warfare itself. Men like Lieutenant Howard Addy had become operators of complex systems rather than traditional combatants, their skills measured in technical proficiency rather than physical courage. The loneliness of patrol flying had intensified as missions became longer and more technically demanding, but the psychological burden had shifted from the existential uncertainty of ineffective tactics to the moral weight of systematic efficiency. Success brought its own form of trauma. The knowledge that electronic accuracy had made killing mechanical, predictable, and increasingly divorced from the traditional concepts of honor and heroism that had defined military service. The radar scope reduced human enemies to electronic abstractions, blips on a screen that represented not individual sailors, but tactical problems to be solved through mathematical calculation. The searchlight transformed killing into illumination, revelation, and the precise application of explosive force to coordinates in space. This was warfare as engineering problem, victory as technical achievement, and heroism as the faithful execution of systematic procedures. The intelligence reports that documented German submarine crew morale during this period revealed the psychological impact of technological obsolescence on experienced naval professionals. Intercepted personal correspondence described the transformation of submarine service from elite assignment to probable death sentence, with experienced crews requesting transfer to surface vessels and submarine schools reporting declining enrollment, despite increased incentive. The technical confidence that had sustained German submarine operations through the early years of the war had been systematically destroyed by the daily reality of Allied technological superiority. U-boat crews, accustomed to the protective anonymity of darkness and depth, found themselves hunted by invisible adversaries who could detect their presence through conditions that had once guaranteed concealment. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical destruction. The knowledge that survival depended not on skill, experience, or tactical excellence, but on the random factors that determined whether Allied patrol aircraft would be present at any given time and location. This was the nightmare of technological warfare, the reduction of human agency to statistical probability, where courage and cowardice became irrelevant variables in equations determined by industrial capacity and scientific innovation. The broader strategic implications of these developments extended far beyond the immediate tactical success of individual patrol missions. The Allied achievement in anti-submarine warfare represented the first systematic application of what would later be recognized as electronic warfare doctrine, the integration of detection, communication, and weapon systems into coordinated networks that could operate across vast geographical areas with unprecedented precision. The radar-equipped patrol aircraft of 1943 were prototypes for the surveillance systems that would define military operations for decades to come, establishing principles of technological integration that would influence everything from strategic bombing to space exploration. More immediately, the success of Allied anti-submarine operations had ensured the survival of the convoy system that sustained British resistance and enabled the buildup of American forces for the eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. The statistical victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, tonnage preserved, shipping lanes secured, supply lines protected, had created the logistical foundation for Allied victory in the broader conflict. The technological revolution that began with radar-equipped patrol aircraft had demonstrated that modern warfare would be determined not by traditional military virtues, but by the systematic application of scientific knowledge to the problems of detection, communication, and precision weapons delivery. The post-war analysis of these operations would reveal deeper implications for the nature of military innovation in democratic society. The rapid development and deployment of advanced radar and searchlight systems had required unprecedented cooperation between civilian scientists, military engineers, and industrial manufacturers, creating institutional relationships that would persist long after the immediate wartime emergency had passed. The technical schools that trained radar operators had established educational models that would influence military training for generations, emphasizing mathematical competency, electronic systems knowledge, and the psychological skills necessary for operating complex equipment under combat conditions. Perhaps most significantly, the success of technological warfare had demonstrated the decisive importance of scientific research as a military capability, establishing the precedent for sustained government investment in research and development that would characterize the post-war period. The men who had operated radar systems over the North Atlantic would return to civilian careers in electronics, aerospace, and computer technology, carrying with them technical skills and organizational experience that would drive innovation in industries that had not existed before the war. Lieutenant Howard Addy completed his tour of duty in February 1944, having participated in the systematic destruction of German submarine capability in the North Atlantic. His final mission report, filed with the matter-of-fact precision that characterized military documentation, recorded the successful illumination and attack of U-boat contacts on 17 separate occasions, contributing to a collective achievement that had transformed the strategic balance of the war at sea. The report contained no speculation about the broader implications of technological warfare, no analysis of the psychological impact of electronic killing, no reflection on the moral complexities of victory achieved through systematic industrial application rather than individual heroism. Like most men who had participated in the technological revolution that decided the Battle of the Atlantic, Addy understood his role as the faithful execution of procedures developed by others, the operation of systems whose principles he understood, but whose broader significance would only become apparent in retrospective analysis. He had been an instrument of historical change rather than its architect, a technician whose competence had contributed to outcomes that extended far beyond his individual comprehension or responsibility. The German submarine fleet that had once dominated the North Atlantic never recovered from the technological obsolescence imposed by Allied radar and searchlight systems. By the spring of 1944, U-boat operations had been reduced to occasional harassment missions that achieved negligible strategic impact while continuing to consume resources that the German war economy could not afford to waste. The statistical superiority of Allied anti-submarine capabilities had become so overwhelming that submarine attacks on protected convoys approached mathematical impossibility, forcing German naval strategy to shift toward defensive operations that acknowledged the permanent loss of initiative in the Battle of the Atlantic. The confident predictions of Admiral Dönitz, who who had promised to starve Britain into submission through systematic destruction of merchant shipping, had been rendered historically irrelevant by the patient application of scientific method to the problems of detection and destruction. The ocean that had once been described as a German lake had become an Allied highway, protected by invisible networks of radar surveillance and patrolled by aircraft whose electronic eyes could penetrate darkness, weather, and the desperate attempts at concealment that had once guaranteed submarine survival. In the decades that followed, the technological principles demonstrated by Allied anti-submarine operations would evolve into the surveillance and weapons systems that would define modern warfare. The radar sets that had been revolutionary in 1943 would become routine components of military and civilian aircraft, their capabilities enhanced by developments in computer technology, satellite communications, and precision guidance systems that could achieve accuracy levels impossible to imagine during the Second World War. The searchlight attacks that had proven so devastatingly effective against German submarines would be superseded by infrared detection systems, laser guidance technology, and autonomous weapons platforms that could identify, track, and destroy targets without direct human intervention. The men who had learned to operate these primitive systems over the North Atlantic had participated in the first phase of a technological revolution that would continue to transform military operations, civilian society, and the fundamental relationship between human decision-making and mechanical systems. Yet the human elements of the story, the courage required to fly 15-hour missions over hostile waters, the technical skill necessary to operate complex equipment under combat conditions, the psychological resilience needed to function effectively in isolation and constant danger, remained irreducible to technological analysis. Men like Lieutenant Addy and Petty Officer Kowalski had demonstrated that successful military innovation required not only advanced equipment, but human operators capable of adapting theoretical principles to the practical demands of combat operations. The radar scope and searchlight had been tools whose effectiveness depended entirely on the competence, judgment, and dedication of the men who operated them under conditions that tested every aspect of professional military training. The technological revolution that decided the Battle of the Atlantic had been achieved through the systematic application of human intelligence to the problems of electronic warfare, creating capabilities that neither technology nor human skill could have achieved independently. The legacy of these operations extended beyond military history to encompass broader questions about the relationship between technological innovation and democratic society. The rapid development of radar and electronic warfare systems had required government coordination of scientific research, industrial production, and military training on a scale that demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of systematic technological mobilization. The success of Allied anti-submarine operations had proven that democratic societies could achieve decisive technological superiority over totalitarian adversaries, but only through institutional changes that centralized decision-making, redirected economic resources, and subordinated individual preferences to collective strategic objectives. The men who had operated radar systems over the North Atlantic had been instruments of democratic technological mobilization, their individual skills contributing to collective achievements that could not have been accomplished through traditional military organization or peacetime economic arrangement. The final statistics of the Battle of the Atlantic reflected the mathematical precision of technological warfare. German submarine losses that exceeded construction rates by margins that made continued operations unsustainable, convoy protection rates that approached theoretical maximum efficiency, and shipping tonnage preserved in quantities sufficient to support Allied strategic objectives in multiple theaters of operation. Behind these numbers lay human stories of technical innovation, operational adaptation, and psychological endurance that had transformed both the conduct of warfare and the relationship between individual capability and collective achievement. The men who had flown patrol missions over the North Atlantic had participated in historical changes whose implications would continue to influence military operations, technological development, and social organization for generations to come, establishing precedents for the systematic application of scientific knowledge to strategic problems that would define the characteristics of modern society. The ocean remembers nothing of the men who fought above its surface during those crucial months when radar beams first penetrated the darkness that had protected German submarines. The electronic signatures that once revealed the presence of submerged steel have long since faded into the background radiation of a technological civilization that takes surveillance and precision detection for granted. Yet the principles established by those early radar operators, the patient application of scientific method to tactical problem, the systematic coordination of detection and weapons system, the psychological adaptation required for technological warfare, continue to influence military operations in contexts that the men of 1943 could never have imagined. Their contribution was not the dramatic heroism of individual combat, but the patient competence that made systematic victory possible, demonstrating that in technological warfare, success belongs not to the boldest or the strongest, but to those who can most effectively integrate human intelligence with mechanical precision. History isn't just written, it's remembered through those who still care to listen. The invisible fleet that once terrorized the North Atlantic was defeated not by superior courage or more powerful weapons, but by men who learned to see in darkness through electronic eyes, proving that in modern warfare, knowledge is the ultimate weapon and precision, the highest form of courage. What story should we tell next? Subscribe to keep their memory alive. Your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps me keep making better content for you.